Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. Most of the stories we tell on this channel are warnings. A man comes here chasing something: love, escape, a cheaper life, a second chance. And what he finds instead costs him more than he bargained for. That's the pattern. You know it if you've been watching. But every so often, something different lands in the inbox. This one is from Brendan, 63 years old. Retired roofer from County Roscommon in the west of Ireland. He's been living in Cebu for 2 years now. He's had one wife, a proper Irish marriage, 3 decades long, and he now has a partner here in the Philippines. And he wrote to us, not because he got burned, not because he lost everything, but because he wanted to talk honestly about both. The differences. What surprised him. What he wasn't ready for. What he thinks men like him need to hear before they get on a plane. He asked for no sympathy and no drama. Just the truth as he found it. Some of what he says about Filipino women will make the cynics in the comments uncomfortable. Some of what he says about his Irish marriage will make the romantics uncomfortable. Good. That means he's telling the truth. Here's his story, in his own words. I spent 40 years on rooftops. Connaught, mostly. The Midlands when the work took me. Galway, Westmeath, up into Leitrim sometimes when there was nothing else going. You learn to read a roof the way other men read faces. You look for where the weakness is hiding, where the damp is working its way in, where something that looks solid has gone soft underneath. 40 years of that, and you start doing it with everything. The best thing about the job, and I mean this genuinely, was the silence. Up on a roof in Roscommon, on a grey Tuesday morning with nothing around you but the bog and the wind and the sound of your own breathing. Men talk about mindfulness now, all that carry on. We just called it work. I'd come down at the end of the day, and Mare would have the dinner on. That was the arrangement. Not written down anywhere, nothing ever said about it. It was just how we were. She cooked, I ate, we watched the news, she told me what her sister said about whatever. I half listened. 31 years of that. And I want to be clear about something, because I know how that sounds to people who weren't there. It was a good life. It suited us. Mare was a sensible woman who didn't need a lot of fuss, and I was a man who didn't produce a lot of fuss. And we got on. We raised 2 kids. We paid the mortgage off. We went to Mass on Sunday. That was us. She got sick in 2018. Ovarian cancer. By the time they found it, it had been there a while. I'm not going to go through all of it. I don't think that serves anyone. What I'll say is that the 4 years between the diagnosis and the end of it were the most useful years of my life, in a strange way. I learned to cook. I learned what every medication was for and when to give it. I learned which nurses on which ward would actually call you back, and which ones wouldn't. I learned that the chair beside a hospital bed, the vinyl one with the metal armrests, gets slightly more comfortable after about 2 weeks, if you bring a cushion from home. I know that, because I slept in one of those chairs more nights than I can count. She died in February of 2022. I was there. Of course I was there. And then I went home to an empty house, and I was purposeless. That's the only word I have for it. I wasn't destroyed by grief. Not in the way you might imagine. I'd had 4 years of grieving while she was still alive, in a way. What I was empty of function. I'd been useful every single day for 4 years, and then one morning I wasn't, and I had no idea what to do with my hands. The sympathy visits came for a while. People from the parish, the lads from work, her sisters. They'd sit in the kitchen and drink tea and say the right things, and then they'd leave, and the house would go quiet again. And the house was wrong-shaped without her. too big, full of her things, her smell on certain things still, for longer than you'd think. I sold it in the spring of 2023. Got a fair price, a little over 290,000 euros. After what was left on the mortgage, I cleared roughly 158,000 euros. Sat in my account at AIB. I hadn't touched it. I didn't know what it was for yet. My nephew Xiaran is the one responsible for all of this, and I tell him that regularly. He's 26, works in IT, knows more about the internet than is probably healthy. We were at his parents' place for Sunday lunch, my brother's house. And after the food, Xiaran had his laptop out, and he was showing me something. A YouTube video. Some fella walking around Cebu, talking about how much his apartment cost per month, and what he paid for lunch. I watched it with what I hoped was the expression of a man who found this mildly interesting and nothing more. That night, I watched 4 more on my phone in bed. What struck me, and this took me a while to admit to myself, wasn't the weather, though the weather looked fine. Wasn't the cost of things, though the cost of things was genuinely hard to believe after 20 years of Dublin prices creeping outward. Wasn't the women, though I'm 63, not dead, so I noticed. What actually got me, the thing that kept pulling me back to those videos, was that the men in them had things to do. They were figuring something out. Every one of them had a project. Find a flat, learn the transport system, find a decent place to eat, sort out the visa, meet people. Small things. But they were busy with them. They had a reason to be somewhere specific on a specific day. After a year of sitting in an empty house in Roscommon with nowhere to be, that looked like medicine. I did my research the way I do everything, which is methodically and without telling anyone. I read about the tourist visa. 30 days initially, extendable. You can stay a good while if you manage it right. I read about Cebu versus Manila versus Davao. I read about what things actually cost versus what the videos said they cost, because I know that men making YouTube videos have a tendency to make their life look cheaper than it is. I read the forums, the expat groups, all of it. I read the warnings too. I'm not stupid. And then I booked a flight. One way, because I didn't know when I'd want to come back, and I didn't see the point of paying for a return I might not use. I landed at Mactan Cebu International Airport on a Thursday in March. In Phoebe, I remember the doors opening onto the pickup area, and the heat it didn't hit you exactly, it more wrapped itself around you. Like opening an oven, except the oven smells of exhaust fumes and something frying somewhere, and what I later found out was ilang-ilang from a garland at a nearby stall. The noise of it, horns and engines and someone on a tannoy, and families all shouting at once. I stood there for a moment with my one suitcase and thought, right, I'd booked a serviced apartment in Lahug. Nothing fancy. A bed, a small kitchen, an air conditioning unit that worked, a window that looked at another building. €40 a night. I wasn't there for fancy. The first week I sweated through every shirt I owned and ate every meal at a turo-turo around the corner from the apartment. One of those canteens where the food's already cooked and you just point at what you want. Adobo, rice, something with pork. It cost me less than €2 a meal, and nobody tried to talk to me, which at that point was exactly what I wanted. I was 63 years old, recently widowed, sitting in a city I'd never been to, in a country I'd never visited, eating rice for the 3rd time in a day. Back home in Roscommon, my brother was probably telling someone I'd lost the plot entirely. He wasn't entirely wrong, but I wasn't entirely wrong either. By the end of the 2nd week, I'd developed what you might call a routine, which is the thing I always do when I'm somewhere unfamiliar. It's a roofer's habit. You don't start on a new job by doing the complicated bits. You walk the structure first. You get to know it. So I walked. Every morning, early, before the heat got serious, down through La Hogue, out toward the IT park where the glass buildings are, back through the side streets where the houses are stacked close together, and there's always a sari-sari store on every corner selling sachets of shampoo and boiled sweets and San Miguel in small bottles. I'd stop at a bakery near Gaisano Mall most mornings. Pan de sal, the small bread rolls they eat for breakfast, still warm from the oven. 20 pesos for a bag of them. About 30 cents. I ate them walking. The city was louder than anything I'd been prepared for. Not just the traffic, though the traffic was something. Jeepneys and tricycles and motorbikes weaving through each other in a system that looked like chaos but seemed to work, mostly, in the way that things which look like chaos often do if you watch long enough. It was everything at once. Roosters going at 4 in the morning, church bells at 6, karaoke, somehow, at hours when no reasonable person should be singing. I heard someone doing a fairly committed version of My Way at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night through the wall of my building. I lay there listening to it and thought, Mare would have found this absolutely hilarious. I thought about her a lot in those first 2 weeks, not with the heavy grief of the first year, more with, I don't know how to describe it exactly. Like noticing something was missing from a view you'd been looking at for so long you'd stopped seeing it properly. There was a version of Cebu I kept constructing in my head, where she was there with me, commenting on things, pulling a face at the heat, insisting on factor 50. And then she wasn't, and the city went back to being just itself. That's not self-pity. I want to be clear about that. It's just what it was. The expat forums I'd read before coming had warned me about certain things. The bars along Mango Avenue, the girls outside certain establishments on Colin Street who would call out to you as you passed. I walked through all of it with the polite disinterest of a man who had read the warnings and taken them at face value. I wasn't there for any of that, or I'd told myself I wasn't, which is almost the same thing, but not quite. What I was actually looking for, and I couldn't have told you this at the time, was something to organize myself around. A reason. 40 years of work had given me that. 4 years of nursing Mare had given me that. And now I was a retired widower in a hot city, with a month's accommodation paid and no particular plan. And the absence of a plan was starting to feel less like freedom and more like a question I didn't have an answer to. The Sunday of the 3rd week, I decided to go to Mass. Now, I should explain what I mean by that, because I'm not a holy man. I haven't been what you'd call a practicing Catholic since Mare stopped being well enough to go, really. And before that, I went because it was Sunday. And that's what you did in Roscommon if you didn't want your neighbors talking. It's cultural, mostly. The ritual of it. You know where you are in a Mass. There's a beginning and a middle and an end, and everyone around you knows what comes next. And for a man who'd spent 2 weeks being thoroughly confused by everything around him, that sounded appealing. I found a parish church about 10 minutes' walk from the apartment. I don't know the name of it offhand. It was white-painted, bigger than it looked from the outside, a statue of Our Lady in blue and white by the entrance that had fresh flowers at her feet. Someone had put a small electric fan on the ground, pointing up at her. I thought that was a kind thing to do. Inside, it was packed. I mean genuinely packed. People standing at the back and along the sides, children everywhere. The kind of Sunday Mass attendance that Irish parishes haven't seen since the 80s. The singing was different to what I knew, louder, less self-conscious, people actually meaning it, rather than mumbling through it with their eyes on the floor. There was a woman near me who sang with her eyes shut and her hands open at her sides, and I found myself listening to her instead of following along. The heat inside the church was substantial. I was sweating through my shirt inside 5 minutes. I noticed a family 2 rows ahead of me. A woman in her 50s in a white blouse, 2 younger women beside her, all of them dressed with care. The kind of dressed up that takes effort and means something. And between the 2 younger ones was a woman, maybe late 30s, with her hair pinned back, following the Mass properly, responding at the right moments, none of the vague murmuring of someone going through motions. I noticed her the way you notice something that fits where it is. I didn't think anything of it beyond that. After Mass, the courtyard filled up fast. That lovely noise of a crowd all talking at once, children running, people stopping to catch up with each other. I was standing near the gate, conspicuous. I know, you can't be a large, pale Irishman in a Filipino parish and not be conspicuous, when I became aware of a small commotion a few feet away. The woman from 2 rows ahead. Her mother had clearly said something to her, a nudge and a nod in my direction, and the woman was doing the politely obliging thing of coming over, not because she particularly wanted to, but because her mother had decided someone should say hello to the lost-looking foreigner. She introduced herself as Grace. She said it simply, the way you'd say it to a colleague at work. Her English was exact and careful, each word chosen rather than just produced. She asked where I was from. I said Roscommon. She said she'd never heard of it. I said that was fine, most people hadn't. She smiled at that. Not a big smile. Just the small one that means you've said something that landed correctly. Her mother was watching us from about 6 feet away, with the focused attention of a woman who'd made a decision and was monitoring its progress. We talked for maybe 10 minutes there in the courtyard, in the noise and the heat, with a dog wandering between people's legs and someone's child staring up at me from about knee-height, as though I were a notable geological feature. Grace told me she was a bookkeeper at a logistics company. She asked what I had done for work. I said roofing. She looked at my hands and nodded as though this made sense. Before we parted, she took out her phone. Not flirtatiously, more practically, the way you'd take out a pen. She gave me her number, and I gave her mine. She said if I needed help finding anything in the city, I could message her. I said I appreciated that. She said goodbye with a slight bow of her head, collected her mother and her sisters, and they left. I walked back to the apartment, got a bottle of water from the sari-sari store on the corner, sat on the small chair on the balcony and looked at the building opposite and thought about nothing in particular. She messaged me that Tuesday to ask if I'd tried the coffee at a place near the Ayala Center. Said it was better than the chains, and cheaper too. I said I hadn't. She said she could show me on Thursday, if I had nothing on. I had nothing on. The coffee place was a small shop on a side street off Osmana Boulevard, the kind that has 4 tables and a handwritten menu on a chalkboard and no air conditioning but a ceiling fan that worked hard enough that you didn't mind. Grace was already there when I arrived. She'd ordered for herself, black coffee, no sugar, which told me something about her immediately, though I couldn't have said what exactly. She'd also ordered a pain de sal for me without asking. Said the bakery up the road made them better than the one near Gaisano. She was right, as it happened. We talked for about 2 hours. I say talked. She asked questions, and I answered them, mostly. And then she answered mine with the careful precision of someone who thinks before they speak. I found that restful. There's a type of person who fills silence with whatever comes out, and I've never known what to do with that type. Grace was not that type. She asked about Ireland. Not about the tourist things. She didn't ask about cliffs or castles or any of that. She asked what the weather was actually like. She asked whether people really did talk to strangers in pubs the way she'd seen in films. I said sometimes, if you gave them the right opening, and sometimes not even then. She found this interesting in a genuine way. The way you find something interesting when it doesn't match what you'd assumed. I asked about her work. She explained what a bookkeeper does at a logistics firm with the slightly weary patience of someone who's explained it many times to people who don't quite follow. I followed. Numbers are numbers, more or less, wherever you are. She'd been there 7 years. She was, she said, the main income for her family. Her father did small repair jobs when they came in. Her mother managed the house. 2 younger sisters, one in her 2nd year at the University of Cebu, one finishing secondary school. All of them in one house in a barangay about 20 minutes from the city center. I noted all of that at the time. I did note it. I just didn't. I don't know. I was listening to the facts of it without yet understanding what the facts meant in context. A woman supporting 4 people on a bookkeeper's salary in Cebu. I heard that as a thing she was telling me about her life. I didn't hear it as something that would eventually become relevant to mine. That's not stupidity, I'd argue. That's just not having the right frame yet. We met again the following week. And the week after that. It wasn't dates, exactly. Not in any formal sense. It was more that we were both in the same city and we got along, and getting along felt like enough reason to keep meeting. She showed me where to buy decent vegetables without paying tourist prices at the SM supermarket. I told her about roofing, about what you can tell about a house from its roof, about the particular misery of doing ridge tiles in a Galway downpour in November. She listened to this with what seemed like genuine interest, which I found slightly baffling. I extended my tourist visa at the Bureau of Immigration office on Mandaue, a process that took most of a morning and involved a queue, some forms, and a fee of about 3,500 pesos, roughly 54 euros. Not complicated if you know what you're doing, and Grace had told me exactly what to expect. I started keeping a note of what things cost, not out of anxiety, but out of habit. I'd always estimated carefully on jobs. Old practice. Somewhere in those first 4 or 5 weeks, without either of us announcing it, the meetings became something more than practical. She started texting in the evenings. Nothing dramatic. A photo of something she'd cooked, or a news story about Ireland she'd found because she'd looked it up. I responded. She responded. This was, I realized, how it had built without my quite noticing it building. I want to be honest about something here, because I think honesty is the point of telling this at all. I was attracted to her. I'm 63, not 103, but more than that, more than anything physical. What drew me to Grace was that she treated me as a person with a particular history and a particular way of being, not as a category. I'd read enough forums to know that some men come to the Philippines and get treated as a walking wallet with a passport attached, and that some men actively seek that out because it makes them feel important. I didn't want that. And Grace didn't offer it. She offered something considerably more inconvenient, which was a real opinion of me. She thought I was too quiet. She said so. She said I looked like a man who kept things to himself, and that this was probably fine, but she wanted to know if it was fine or if it was actually not fine. But I'd decided it was fine. I said I'd have to think about that. She said that was exactly what she meant. Mary had done something similar in the early years, not in those words, but the instinct to press on the thing you're not being told that I recognized. What I want to say to anyone watching this who's thinking about coming here and meeting someone. The fact that a woman is warm and curious and present does not mean she's simple. I see men in the expat groups online who talk about Filipino women as though warmth is a form of simplicity, as though being affectionate means being uncomplicated. Grace was one of the least uncomplicated people I've met in my life. She had a full interior world with its own logic and its own demands, and understanding it took work, and the work was worth doing. But it was work. By the end of April, I'd stopped thinking seriously about going home. I hadn't made any decision. I'd just stopped making the decision to leave. That's when I met her family. She'd mentioned it a couple of times, not pushing, just noting, the way you note something that will need attending to eventually. Her mother had heard about me, Grace said, the Irishman from Mass who didn't know where to find good coffee. Nana, that was her mother, had suggested Sunday lunch. Grace said I didn't have to come if I wasn't ready, but there was something in the way she said it that suggested not coming would itself be a kind of answer. So I went. The house was maybe 20 minutes out of the city center by grab, past the SM City Mall, through a couple of turns into a barangay where the streets narrowed and the houses got closer together, and there was a basketball court at the end of the road with 3 teenage boys doing absolutely nothing in particular on it. The house was concrete, single-story, a small garden at the front with a flowering plant in a painted pot that someone had taken some care over. I stepped inside, and there were, at a rough count, 10 people in a space designed for considerably fewer. Nena came at me immediately with food. Rodrigo, Grace's father, stood up and shook my hand with the gravity of a man conducting formal business. He was smaller than I'd expected, with very precise movements. A mechanic's hands, I noticed, similar to my own in the sense of looking like they'd been used. The 2 sisters were introduced, then cousins, an aunt, a neighbor who had apparently just materialized. I can't account for all of them. I sat where I was put and ate what I was given and said salamat, thank you, when I thought I should, which Grace had taught me earlier that week. The food was remarkable. Lechon, which is roasted pork, and the skin of it is like nothing you've had. Crisp and fatty and rich in a way that proper crackling tries to be and rarely achieves. Rice, of course. A fish soup called sinigang that I was suspicious of and then was not suspicious of at all after the first spoonful. Someone had made pancit, which is a noodle dish, and someone else had brought lumpia, which are spring rolls, and the table was too small for all of it, but they made it fit. I understood, watching all of this being laid out, that this meal had cost them something, not a ruinous amount, but something, more than a typical Sunday, more than they'd have done for themselves. It was an act of respect and welcome, and also, I think, of assessment. They were sizing me up and feeding me at the same time, which is a very sensible way to go about things. I passed whatever the test was. Nena kept topping up my plate. Rodrigo asked, through Grace's translation, whether Irish people ate rice. I said not traditionally, but I was adapting. He nodded at this as if it were a reasonable answer. I drove home that evening in a grab, watching the city lights from the window, full of lechon, and mildly overwhelmed in a way that wasn't unpleasant. Grace texted me when I got back. She asked if it was too much. I said it was a lot. She said yes, it usually is. Then she sent a laughing emoji, which I'm fairly sure was the first emoji she'd ever sent me, and I took that as a good sign. After that first Sunday lunch, I was part of the furniture. Not in any formal sense. Nobody said anything, nothing was declared, but the invitations kept coming, and I kept accepting them, and after a while not accepting would have been the thing that needed explaining. The months from May through to September had a shape to them that I found genuinely good. Grace worked Monday to Friday, so we had weekday evenings sometimes, and weekends more reliably. We fell into a rhythm the way you fall into a rhythm with someone compatible. Not by design, just by repetition and adjustment. She'd text when she finished work. I'd usually be cooking something, or walking, or sitting on the balcony watching the street below with a San Miguel and no particular agenda. I'd moved out of the service department in Lahug by June and into a two-bedroom place in a quieter part of Mabolo. 22,000 pesos a month, roughly 340 euros, which included the water, and seemed fair for what it was. My Irish state pension was landing each month, about 1,100 euros, which covered the rent and most of the living costs without touching the savings. That suited me. I'm not extravagant by nature. We went to Malapascua in July. Grace's idea, she'd been meaning to go for years and hadn't, which is a very specific kind of not doing something I recognized. You put off the things that are nearby because they'll always be there. Anyway, we took the bus north from Cebu City. A couple of hours on a road that tested the suspension, then a small banca boat across to the island. The crossing took maybe 30 minutes, and I sat in the bow, watching the water go from green to blue, and thought, right, this is what that looks like. The beach on Malapascua is white sand, which sounds like a description but doesn't prepare you for the actual whiteness of it. We stayed 2 nights in a small guest house. Nothing fancy, a fan room, about 1,800 pesos a night split between us, so less than 30 euros each. Grace had packed a cool bag with rice and some leftover adobo from her mother's house, which she produced on the beach the first afternoon, as though this were completely normal, which for her it was. I burned, badly. Arms, back of the neck, the tops of my feet like a complete Egypt, because I'd taken my shoes off and forgotten about them. Grace found this the funniest thing that had happened in some time. She laughed in the way she laughed when something genuinely got her, which was fully and without covering her mouth, and she told me I looked like a boiled prawn, which was both accurate and unkind. And I said so, and she laughed more. I want to mark that moment because it's the kind of thing that tells you something. Not the laughter itself, but the ease of it. No performance, no checking whether it was all right to say. Just the laugh, and then a pause, and then her putting aloe vera on the back of my neck with more care than the mockery might have suggested she'd bother with. We talked on that trip in a different way than we'd talked in coffee shops in the city. More slowly, more tangentially. She told me about her first job, at a small accounting office when she was 22, and how her first salary, less than 8,000 pesos a month, had gone almost entirely to her family, because her father had been between work and her sister needed school books. She said this without bitterness, just as a fact of how it had been. I said that must have been difficult. She said it was the only way she'd known how to do it, so she hadn't really thought of it as difficult. She'd thought of it as Tuesday. That's the moment I think about when I'm trying to explain to people what I mean about context. Grace had been the family's financial backbone since she was barely an adult. Not because anyone had made her feel guilty about it, though the guilt was certainly available and sometimes used, but because it was simply the shape her life had. Eldest daughter. Responsible one. That's the role, and she'd grown into it so completely she didn't experience it as a role anymore. It was just her. I understood that. I'd spent 31 years being the person who showed up to things, fixed things, managed things. That's not a complaint. It's an identity. The financial requests started arriving around month 3, which was June. I want to be precise about how they came, because the how matters. Grace never asked me for money for herself. Not once. Not in the whole of our time together. What happened was more indirect than that. A mention, a situation described, a problem made visible. And I, being the kind of man who sees a problem and instinctively looks for the solution, would offer, and the offer would be accepted. The first was the university enrollment. Her youngest sister, May, was going into her second year at the University of Cebu, and the semester fees were due. 28,000 pesos, which worked out to roughly 430 euros. Grace mentioned it on a Tuesday evening when we were eating at a carinderia near my apartment. A tiny place, 4 plastic tables, the owner's mother watching a soap opera on a phone in the corner. Grace wasn't asking. She was thinking out loud about whether she could cover it from her own salary this month or would need to wait until the following week. I said I'd sort it. She looked at me for a moment and then said, "Thank you," in a way that was quiet and genuine, and didn't make a production of it. I transferred the money to her GCash account that night. Done. The second, about 6 weeks later, was Rodrigo's motorcycle. It was his main tool. He did small deliveries, odd jobs, whatever came in, and the engine had given up. A second-hand replacement was 45,000 pesos, roughly 700 euros. I'd met Rodrigo by this point, had sat across from him at 4 or 5 Sunday lunches. A quiet man who fixed things and didn't waste words. I liked him. When Grace told me about the motorcycle, I didn't wait to be asked. I offered. She said her father would want to pay me back. I said Rodrigo could buy me a San Miguel sometime. She translated that to him the following Sunday, and he laughed, which was the most expressive I'd seen him. The third was different in feel. A cousin, not one I'd met, had needed an appendectomy. Emergency admission to Cebu Doctors Hospital, which is private, because the public hospital had a wait. The bill came to 80,000 pesos, roughly 1,240 euros. This one Grace brought to me more formally, sitting down, explaining the situation carefully, saying she understood if it was too much. I paid it. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound generous. I'm telling you because I want to be honest about the process. By September, I'd given out roughly 153,000 pesos in total. Call it 2,400 euros. And I had 158,000 euros in a bank account in AIB in Athlone. So, in raw percentage terms, it was nothing. Less than 2% of what I had. But, and this is the thing I want you to hear, I had started doing the calculation. I hadn't done the calculation in June when I paid May's fees. I'd just paid them. By September, I was keeping a mental running total. And the fact that I was keeping a running total meant something had shifted in how I was thinking about all of this, even if I hadn't yet put words to what that shift was. I didn't say anything yet. That came later. What I did instead was watch. And the watching was useful, because what I was watching wasn't a scam. It was a system, old, embedded, functioning by its own logic. Grace was the pillar. Everything leaned on the pillar. And the pillar had, without either of us making a conscious decision about it, started to include me in its load-bearing capacity. There's a concept here, I learned the word later, from an older expat I met at a coffee place in Lahug. Utang na loob, debt of gratitude. The idea that if someone does something good for you, the obligation to reciprocate runs deep and long, runs through families, runs across generations. It's not ingratitude if you keep asking. It's the opposite. It's a recognition that the person is capable of giving and that to stop asking would be to treat them as less. I'm simplifying, but that's roughly the shape of it. I found that genuinely interesting. I'm Irish. We have our own version of this, in a muted, never-spoken form. You help your neighbor with his hay, because someday the hay will need helping, and you'll need him to come. Nobody says that, but everyone understands it. The difference was scale, and the fact that I had no hay. By October, I had a life in Cebu. That's the only way I can describe it. Not a holiday. Not a temporary arrangement I was waiting to end. a life. I had a regular table at a turo on V. Rama Avenue, where the woman behind the counter had started putting aside the fish stew when she saw me coming because she'd noticed I ordered it every time. I knew which grab drivers to tip well and which ones would take the long route if you weren't watching the map. I'd learned enough Cebuano to say good morning, to say thank you, to ask how much something was. Basic things, but they mattered. People appreciated them in a way that surprised me, then stopped surprising me, then became something I understood. In a country that was colonized for 400 years, a foreigner making the effort to say even 3 words in the local language is a different kind of gesture than it might appear. I'd also done a border run in September. The tourist visa extends in 2-month increments, but you can only go so far before you need to leave the country and re-enter to reset the clock properly. I flew to Kuala Lumpur for 2 nights, a thing I did with the mild irritation of a man completing necessary paperwork, not the enthusiasm of someone on a holiday, and then came back. Cost me about €350 all in. Grace texted when my flight landed. I noticed that I'd expected her to. The Sunday lunches had, by this point, expanded considerably. What had started as Grace's immediate family, 5 people, including me, now regularly included a brother-in-law called Romar, who'd married Grace's cousin and ran a small sari-sari store near the barangay hall that was doing, by his own account, not brilliantly. A nephew aged 9 called Jojo, who had decided I was the most interesting object in the room at every gathering, and would ask me questions about Ireland with the focused interrogation of a small detective. An aunt, Nana's sister, who appeared irregularly but always ate with great concentration and said very little. And various others who rotated in and out in a way I eventually stopped trying to track. I want to be honest about what I felt during those lunches. Most of it was good. Genuinely good. There's a warmth to a Filipino family gathering that isn't performed. It's just what happens when people who genuinely like each other get together and eat too much. The noise, the children running through the house, Rodrigo at the corner of the table drinking his San Miguel and watching everything with quiet approval. Nena pressing more food on me even after I'd said I was done, which I had also stopped resisting because resistance was futile and the food was good. But by October, I had also started doing a different kind of watching. The requests had continued after September. A school shoes situation for Jojo, 2,200 pesos, roughly €34, which I paid without thinking much. Romar's sari-sari store had needed restocking after a slow month. Grace mentioned this in passing. I offered 10,000 pesos, about €155, and it had been accepted. A neighbor of Nana's, a woman I'd never met and was unlikely to meet, had a situation involving a hospital and a bill, and I'm still not entirely sure how this one happened. I found myself giving Grace 15,000 pesos, about €230, to pass along. That one I thought about afterward. I thought, how did that become mine? The total by the October lunch was somewhere above 300,000 pesos. Call it €4,600, over 7 months. Still not devastating in absolute terms. Still less than 3% of what I had. But the calculation had changed quality, if that makes sense. It wasn't a clean running total anymore. It was a question. The dental request came toward the end of that particular Sunday. Nena, apparently, had been having trouble with her teeth for a while and had finally been to a dentist who'd told her she needed a fair bit of work done. The figure Grace mentioned was 35,000 pesos, roughly €540. She said it in the way the requests always came. Not as a demand, not even quite as a request. More as information being made available to a person who might find it relevant. And I sat there at that table, 12 people around it, the sound of the television from the next room, the smell of rice and something frying, Jojo using my arm as a surface to lean on, and I counted the heads. 12. And I thought about how every plate of food on that table had come from a market trip that Grace and I had done together the previous Thursday, because Nana had said she didn't have much in that week. I didn't say anything at the table. I'm not built for that. You don't stand in the middle of a roof and announce your concerns to the scaffold. But when the family started to leave, the gradual dispersal of a Filipino Sunday, which takes considerably longer than you'd expect, because each departure involves its own sub-ceremony of goodbyes and reminders and last pieces of food pressed into people's hands. I asked Grace to stay. We sat at the table after everyone else had gone. The dishes were still there. Someone had left a half-empty bottle of Tanduay rum that nobody had claimed. I looked at it for a moment, and then I looked at Grace. I said, "Grace, I need us to talk about this, because I'm not a bank, and I'm not a bad man, and I'd like to stay being neither." She looked at me. And then something happened that I hadn't been prepared for, which was that her face did something complicated that wasn't anger and wasn't guilt. And then she started to cry. Not the way you cry when you're caught, the way you cry when someone has finally said the thing you couldn't say yourself. She talked for a while, about being the eldest, about how it had always been this way, long before I'd arrived. The salary, the requests, the expectation that she would manage whatever needed managing because that's what the eldest daughter does. About how my arrival hadn't created the system. It had just raised what the system believed was available. And about how she'd known somewhere that it was becoming too much, but that she hadn't known how to say it to her own family. Because to say it would be to name something that everyone preferred to leave unnamed. She hadn't been hiding this from me. She'd been hiding it from herself. I sat with that for a moment. Outside, a jeepney went past with its music up. Jojo had left a plastic dinosaur on the floor near my chair. I looked at it. Then I said, "Right. So let's work out what's reasonable." And we did. What reasonable looked like was this: 15,000 pesos a month to the family. About 230 euros. A fixed amount, transferred to Grace's Gcash on the first of each month, and from there distributed however she and her family decided. No itemization required from my end, no accounting. That was their business. My part was the contribution, not the management of it. Anything above that, any emergency, any unexpected situation, had to come to me directly, in advance, and I'd decide. Not Grace deciding and then telling me. Me being part of the decision before it was made. That was the distinction that mattered. We sat there working this out at a kitchen table in Mabolo, with the ceiling fan going and the smell of the lunch still in the air, and it felt, I don't know, like estimating a job properly, like putting numbers to something that had been fuzzy. Grace wrote it down in a small notebook she produced from her bag. I didn't ask her to. She just did it. I thought that was a good sign. The following week, she told her family. I wasn't there for that conversation. I don't know exactly what was said. What I observed over the following weeks was its effects, and the effects were instructive. Nana went quiet. Not hostile. She was never hostile toward me, but there was a withdrawal, a cooling, that Grace mentioned only once and then didn't mention again. 3 weeks of Sunday lunches where Nana was cordial but not warm, where the food was still good but the atmosphere had a reserve in it that hadn't been there before. Grace sat through all of it without complaint, and without, as far as I could see, capitulating. I watched that carefully. You can tell when someone is holding a position under pressure versus performing the appearance of holding it. She was actually holding it. Romar was less subtle. At a gathering in early December, some combination of extended family, not a Sunday lunch exactly, more of an informal thing for a nephew's birthday, he made a comment. I don't know precisely what he said, because Grace translated only part of it, and did so with the editing of someone who's decided the full version isn't necessary. But I caught the tone, the gesture in my direction, the word "cano" used in a way that wasn't friendly. I looked at Rodrigo when it happened. Rodrigo looked at his San Miguel and said nothing, which told me what Rodrigo thought of Romar's opinion. Grace didn't translate the comment. I didn't ask her to. We drove home in a grab afterward, and she was quiet for a bit. And then she said she was sorry. I said she had nothing to be sorry for. She said she knew, but still. I said I understood that. And we left it there. Here's what I want to say about all of that, because I think it matters. Grace enforcing that boundary with her own family cost her more than it cost me. I was outside the system. She was inside it. For me to say no was a foreigner setting a limit. For her to say no was a daughter and a cousin and a niece telling the people she'd spent her entire life providing for that the ceiling had changed. Those are different things. The social cost fell on her, not me. She paid it. She paid it without drama, and without asking me to validate her constantly, and without, as far as I could tell, resenting me for the position I'd put her in by having the conversation in the first place. And I watched her do that over the course of about 3 months, and I thought, right, this is who she is. That's the moment I've come back to when people ask me whether I trust her. I don't cite the length of time we've been together. I cite that. A person's character is what they do when it costs them something. But I promised this story would be honest in both directions. And it has to be. So let me tell you about the differences. The actual differences. Because that's what the title of this thing is about, and I've been building to it long enough. With Meyer, love was in the doing. This sounds cold, and it isn't. It's that her generation, my generation, in the west of Ireland, you didn't say it much. You showed it by turning up, by fixing the thing that was broken, by having the dinner ready, by not making a fuss when the other person was having a bad week. Love as a form of competent management. We ran parallel to each other, and the parallels were close, and that was enough. Grace is different in ways I'm still sometimes surprised by. 2 years in. She touches my arm when she talks to me. Not always, but regularly. A hand on the forearm, a touch on the shoulder, just to establish that we're in the same conversation. Mara would have found that slightly odd. I found it odd at first, and now I'd notice if it stopped. Grace tells me when she's worried about something, actually tells me. Sits down and says, I'm worried about this. Meyer would have managed worry internally until it resolved, or until it was unavoidable, and then she'd mention it as if it had just arisen. I understood that system because I operate the same way. With Grace, I've had to learn a different response than the one I have available naturally, which is to offer a solution. Sometimes she's not asking for a solution. She's asking for the thing that Mary and I communicated through competence and proximity, to be heard. That's taken time. The practical frictions are real, and I'll not pretend otherwise. Grace operates on a relationship with time that is genuinely different from mine. If we're meant to be somewhere at 7, she'll be ready at 7:15 and see no particular problem with this. I was brought up by a man who said, if you're on time, you're late. These two philosophies do not naturally reconcile. We've reached an arrangement where I tell her things start 30 minutes before they start, which she has probably figured out by now, but which continues to function. She considers it rude to decline food at someone else's house. Not impolite, rude. I have a naturally small appetite, and certain things I don't enjoy, and I have learned to eat them anyway, with an expression of apparent pleasure, which I consider a reasonable concession to make. She has a WhatsApp group with her female relatives that generates messages at a volume and frequency that would concern a man who didn't understand that it was simply how that family stays connected across the city, and the barangays, and the one cousin who moved to Riyadh for work. I've stopped hearing it as noise, mostly. These are not complaints. I want to be clear about that. They're the adjustments you make when you share your life with a person who grew up somewhere different, inside a different set of assumptions. Maya and I had our own adjustments. I have never in my life been able to make small talk at parties. She managed this for 31 years on my behalf, and I managed other things on hers. Every long partnership is a set of compensations and accommodations that become invisible with time. The difference here is that some of what Grace and I navigate isn't just personality, it's culture. And culture is slower to become invisible, but it does, gradually, become familiar. That's not the same thing. But it might be enough. 2 years. That's where I am now. Grace and I moved into a larger apartment in La Hague about 8 months ago. A proper 2-bedroom on the 4th floor, with a balcony that catches a breeze in the evenings. 28,000 pesos a month. Roughly 430 euros. I can see a slice of the sea from the balcony if I stand at the right end of it. I don't own it, of course. Foreigners can't own land here, and putting property in someone's name is a thing I read about in the expat forums long before I came and made a mental note never to do. We rent. That suits me. I've never liked being too fixed to a place. The savings are largely intact. I've spent somewhere between 18,000 euros and 22,000 euros in 2 years total. When I add up everything, rent, food, visa runs, the Malapascua trip, the family contributions, the various ordinary costs of a life. My pension covers the monthly running costs. The savings sit in AIB in Athlone, and I look at them occasionally and find them reassuring, not as wealth exactly, but as evidence that I haven't been foolish. I've looked into the SRRV, the Special Resident Retirees Visa. It would give me long-term legal status without the border runs, which I still do every few months, hopping to Singapore or Kuala Lumpur for 2 nights and coming back. The SRRV requires depositing $10,000 into a Philippine bank as a condition of the visa. I haven't committed to that yet, not because I distrust the system particularly, but because I'm not sure I want to be that fixed. There's something to be said for the optionality of a tourist visa. It keeps a decision open that I'm not ready to close. I want to talk directly now to whoever's watching this and actually considering it. Not the people who are going to comment whatever they've decided to comment regardless of what I say. The ones who are genuinely sitting with this question. Here's what I'd tell you, in the way I'd tell a man on a roof who's about to put his weight on something he hasn't assessed properly. First, do not come here empty. I don't mean financially. I mean come with a sense of what you actually need, not what you think you're supposed to want. I needed purpose and structure, and someone to talk to who wasn't grief-adjacent. I found all of that, but I only found it because I was honest with myself about what I was looking for, and that honesty meant I could recognize it when I found it, instead of projecting a different fantasy onto whatever showed up first. Second, keep your money in your own pocket until you know exactly why it's leaving. Not because Filipino people are thieves. That's not what I'm saying, and it's not what I've experienced. But because generosity without structure becomes obligation without consent for everyone involved. Grace was as trapped in the pattern as I was becoming. The 15,000 pesos a month we settled on is not a small thing. For her family, it's real help. For me, it's manageable. Nobody is pretending it's something it isn't. Third, the warmth is real. I want to say that clearly because I've read the forums and I know what the cynics say, and some of what they say is earned by their own experience, and some of it is just bitterness calcifying into worldview. Grace is warm because she's warm. That's her. It's not a technique, but, and this is the bit the cynics are right about, warmth is not the same as simplicity. She is a complicated person from a complicated context. The warmth and the complexity both belong to her. If you only see one of them, you're not actually seeing her. You're seeing what you came here hoping to find, which is a different thing entirely. Fourth, have the conversation you're avoiding. Whatever it is, have it early, before avoiding it has cost you more than having it would have. I had mine at month 7, which was probably month 5 later than optimal. It cost me 4,600 euros in money that I could reasonably afford, and a conversation I found uncomfortable for about 40 minutes. In return, it produced a relationship that has actual foundations. That's an acceptable exchange. There are things I miss about Ireland. The quiet of it, specifically. The way a Roscommon morning in October looks, the grey light on the bog, the smell of turf smoke from the houses. Kiaran sends me photos of things occasionally, and I look at them for longer than I pretend to. My brother calls most Sundays and asks how I am, and I say grand, and he believes me because it's true, roughly. Grace asked me once what I missed most. I thought about it for a while. I needed to think about it properly, not just say the obvious thing. And I said, the silence up on the roofs. She nodded as if this made sense. She said she understood because she sometimes missed how quiet her grandmother's house was in the province before all the cousins arrived. That, I thought, was actually quite a good conversation. I still go to Mass on Sundays. So does Grace. We go together to the same parish church, where I first saw her 2 rows ahead, dressed carefully, following along properly. It's louder than I'll ever entirely get used to. The fan at the feet of Our Lady still has fresh flowers most weeks. That's probably the most familiar thing of all. And that's where I'll leave it. That was Brendan, 63 years old, retired roofer, County Roscommon. Here at Inside the Philippines, we tell a lot of stories about men who came here with open wallets and closed eyes, and we make no apology for that. Those stories need telling, and they need telling honestly. But Brendan's story needs telling too, because it demonstrates something the cautionary tales can't. What protected him wasn't luck. He didn't happen to meet the right person by accident. He came with a clear head, moved at his own pace, assessed what he was looking at before he put his weight on it, and when the moment came that needed a hard conversation, he had it. Carefully, directly, without drama. And then he watched what happened next. That's methodology, not fortune. The Philippines can be exactly what Brendan found. It can also be exactly what you've seen on this channel in darker stories. The difference between those outcomes often comes down to the same things: how clearly you see, how honestly you communicate, and whether you respect the culture enough to actually understand it, rather than just endure it as the price of admission. If you're thinking about making a move like this, watch more of our stories, the warnings and the ones like Brendan's. And if this one meant something to you, share it with someone who could use it. Subscribe if you haven't, and we'll see you in the next one, here on Inside the Philippines.